year's Ramsay Murray Lecture. It's the latest in a series that we owe to the generous bequest of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Ramsay Murray, a loyal alumnus. And his brief for these lectures was agreeably broad in that they should be on a subject of military or historical or general interest, which gives us quite a lot of scope. Now, tonight and the other events that we do underline our commitment at Selwyn to adding insight and learning that help our understanding of the wider world. And we think it's particularly important we do it now when our community is scattered and we see barriers everywhere. And we're keeping going not only with our core teaching and pastoral care remotely, but with events and talks and lectures like these. And there are even some advantages. For the first time, the Ramsay Murray Lecture is being watched live by more than 400 alumni and friends in countries including Kenya and Serbia, and across Europe and the United States, and from Mexico, South Africa, Japan, as well as Australia, where it must be very late or possibly very early. So do please keep an eye on our website and on the college social media. Just search for Selwyn College, Cambridge, for information about what we're up to. Now, I am delighted tonight to welcome as our lecturer this year, Trevor Phillips, one of the UK's most notable public figures in recent decades and an award-winning broadcaster and writer. Trevor was born in North London, but grew up partly in Guyana, where his parents had come from. And he took a degree in chemistry at Imperial College London. He achieved a number of conspicuous firsts in British public life: the first elected chair of the Greater London Authority and the founding chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. His subsequent roles have ranged from president of the Partnership Council at John Lewis through to being a fellow at the think tank Policy Exchange and serving as a board member at the Barbican Centre. His writing is prolific, and he's to be found most weeks as a columnist in the Times. Through his career, he has never shirked from controversy. He began by being a target of the right, and be in no doubt that he experienced the prejudice that made him fight for equality. In more recent years, he presented a documentary on Channel 4 with the provocative title, Things We Don't Say About Race That Are True. And he has been an opponent of political correctness. He's currently suspended by the Labour Party after accusations of Islamophobia, which arose from his comments about grooming gangs in the north of England. He's now involved in the inquiry into why ethnic minorities appear to be disproportionately affected by COVID-19, though his appointment was criticised by some black activists who claims that he disregards the very real issues and consequences of structural racism in the UK, which arguably he had been one of the first people to identify. So we shall hear now what he has to say tonight. Trevor will speak for about 30 minutes and then there'll be a Q&A, and I'd welcome any questions which I will put to Trevor on your behalf, and you can do that via the chat facility on Zoom. But now it gives me very great pleasure to invite Trevor Phillips to give the Ramsay Murray Lecture for 2020. Trevor.
Thank you very much, Roger, and good afternoon to everybody. It is such a privilege to be given this opportunity to speak to Selwyn alumni and others by you and the Vice Master, Dr. Jonathan O'Sullivan. But it is quite hard not to be a little daunted by it. The task set, as the Master set out for the Ramsay Murray Lecturer, is to speak for almost an hour on a subject of military or historical or general interest. The words general interest imply a breadth of scholarship that few can claim, certainly not me, and I can see how it can be quite difficult to find the right person for this role. Perhaps the satirist and the former president of Cambridge's Footlight Society, Peter Cook, anticipated this problem when he created E.L. Whisty, the great philosopher. Whisty, who, having been chucked out, as he said, from the University of Life, would hold forth in his raincoat from a park bench on a variety of subjects. Asked about his field of study, Whisty replied, "I'm very interested in the universe. I'm specializing in the universe and all that surrounds it." I suspect he would have been the right man for this job. However, my real-life predecessors at the lectern, while no Wisties, have been exceptionally distinguished. They include one of my successors at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the philosopher Honora O'Neill, and one of our country's most outstanding journalists, Frank Gardner of the BBC. I particularly wanted to pay tribute to an early contributor to this series, a friend and a great medical historian, Professor Roy Porter. I got to know Roy, who died in 2001, over my 2 decades reporting on the capital. His book, London, Social History, remains a magisterial survey of the growth of the city, and his many works about the history of medicine are still required reading. Working with him on a series called The Making of Britain, he taught me some valuable lessons about the creation of history. They're best summed up in a passage from his book, The Greatest Benefit to Mankind, A Medical History of Humanity. In it, he said, quote, "The historical record is like the night sky. We see a few stars and group them together into mythic constellations, but what is chiefly visible is the darkness." Roy, a bon viveur, a raconteur, and all-round good guy, wasn't making some gloomy point about our past being shrouded in mystery. What I think he was saying was that people and the events that we often call history are not in and of themselves the reality of the past. They are at best pointers to the vast forces that really shape our world. The historical record does, however, remind us of places that we visited before and journeys that we've made, in hope that going there again, they will help us to prepare for the voyage on which we're about to embark. In short, by looking back, we may learn something to help us find a path through that misty, uncharted territory we call the future. Well, unlike E.L. Wisty, I'm not exactly equipped to provide a chart to the whole of the future, and within the constraints of 30 minutes, all I can do is to call attention to 1 or 2 points of illumination, which I think throw some light on where we may be headed. But I first want to enter a caveat. The human imagination has proven itself limited time and again. We are not gods. We're not even very good computers. We can't dream up all the possible futures available to us. And almost invariably, much of what actually happens to us today lay entirely outside of the imagination of those who tried to anticipate it yesterday. The very fact that I'm here speaking to you in this lecture is a case in point. Let me explain. Selwyn College was founded in 1882 in memory of the first Bishop of New Zealand, George Augustus Selwyn. Its first master, Arthur Littleton, was a close relative by marriage of the Prime Minister, William Gladstone, then in his second term of office. Gladstone's patronage, both financial and political, helped to put the college on a firm footing, and that is why I suppose one of the great bells in Selwyn's chapel is named after Gladstone. I have a personal connection with this history, about which it is impossible not to have some mixed feelings. My earliest known ancestor, born into slavery, was a woman called, ironically, Happy. She was shipped sometime in the 19th century from Barbados to what was then British Guyana. The largest plantation owner in the colony, and very possibly Happy's employer, because by then slavery had ended, was the family of John Gladstone, William's father. When slavery was abolished in 1834, slave owners were compensated for loss of their property. The Gladstones were, it is said, the biggest single beneficiary of such compensation in the empire. I'm not recounting this history in order to call for the removal of the chapel bells. In fact, quite the contrary. I would like to make 2 points arising from this personal history. The first is that the removal of objects that remind us of the part of our history that we find uncomfortable is the greatest cop-out imaginable. Putting them out of sight would be to remove the points of light in the night sky of the historical record that illuminate those dark places in our history. Second, in the vast dark space between the stars of the historical record, there is not a vacuum. Just as in the night sky there is endless dark matter, interacting with objects that are visible to us, pulling the planets hither and thither. In our history, there are connections and currents that bind us all together in ways that are not obvious. And at least part of the object of any inquiry into the past is an attempt to understand those hidden currents. Parts of our history may seem invisible. That does not mean they do not exert an influence on our present and future. And third, this little history tells us that when we peer into the future, there are possibilities that may not even occur to even the greatest minds of our time, precisely because they are minds of our time. When Alexander Ramsay Murray came up to Cambridge in the early 1930s, Britain still ruled over an empire that encompassed more than a quarter of the world's landmass, and on which it was said that the sun never set. The college had for half a century been part of the flourishing of 19th century intellectual life, coming into being in the year of Charles Darwin's death. The raging debate of that time, triggered by Darwin's theory of evolution and the origin of species, and led by Darwin's disciple Thomas Huxley, consumed many in Cambridge. Huxley, by the way, is an alumnus of the university I myself attended, Imperial College, where he had been a professor in the Royal School of Mines. Well, it was against this background that in 1883, Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, a Trinity College Cambridge graduate, published his famous, and some would say infamous, work, Inquiries into the Human Faculty and its Development, the book which gave us first the term eugenics. Today, we regard Galton's ideas as unscientific and unacceptable, but it's worth recalling that during Galton's time, and even Ramsay Murray's, they were commonplace and attracted supporters as various as H.G. Wells, Maurice Stopes, and Winston Churchill. Galton argued the case for eugenics like this, quote, "The science of improving stock to give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable than they would otherwise have had." Galton had written to the Times in 1873, proposing that Africa should be colonized by Chinese immigrants for whose ancient civilization and culture he had a high regard. He argued that, amongst other things, by the way, Europeans were too weak to colonize Africa, but that, quote, "the industrious, order-loving Chinese immigrants would not only maintain their position, but they would multiply and their descendants supplant the inferior Negro race." Well, his opinion of Africans was pretty dim, but let me emphasize, Galton was no outlier in his society. He was a noted statistician. He more or less invented meteorology, publishing the first weather map in the Times. He landed a bucket load of honors for his scientific work, including becoming a Fellow of the Royal Society, a long-standing member of the Council of the Royal Geographical Society, and a member of the Athenaeum. So to learn from his story, we need to judge him as a man of his time. And that means we should ask ourselves, would Galton, or any of his contemporaries, have expected an African slave's descendant to be giving this lecture? Would they have conceived that the newspaper to which he wrote his letter, dismissing Negroes as, quote, "lazy, palavering savages," unquote, would ever employ such a person as a regular columnist? Not in a million years, literally. Yet here we are doing what was then unimaginable, even to a brilliant mind, a century ago. There are some who believe that people such as Galton ought to be written out of history, but there can be no safe spaces from the past if we are to learn its lessons. If we extinguish those points of light that illuminate the darker passages of our history, all we do is remove the only guide to how far we've come, and more importantly, when, where, and why we may have taken the wrong turn. We need to know about the cul-de-sacs that inhibited human flourishing, that engendered cruelty and war, in the hope that we might recognize those dead ends when we meet them again. That said, we also have to take a shot at understanding what Porter's points of light tell us about the future. Otherwise, we simply wait to be overwhelmed by events. The Darwins, the Faradays, the Einsteins knew that almost certainly somebody or something one day would prove them wrong, and that someone would come up with a better theory. That didn't stop them trying to draw on what they knew in order to offer a way forward through the great darkness. And as the Reverend William Watkinson said in 1907, drawing on ancient Chinese wisdom, it is better to light a single candle than to curse the darkness. It would be ridiculous to put myself in the same category as the geniuses I've mentioned, but I'm here and you're here. So I hope you won't think it presumptuous if I offer a few thoughts on what I think some recent points of light say about how we should prepare ourselves for what lies in the mist. And today I want to focus on what people sometimes refer to as identity politics, or perhaps more frequently as the culture wars. I mentioned earlier my connection through Gladstone's bell to the college. I'm indebted to my friend and schoolmate at Queen's College, Guyana, Professor David Dabadin, for drawing this to my attention. David, himself a Selwyn graduate and an outstanding historian, is the descendant of Indian indentured labourers brought to British Guyana in the 19th century. It's probable that his ancestors were also, in effect, owned by the Gladstones. David and I probably share an unreasonable preoccupation with the issue of identity and its potential to divide societies permanently. So I'd like to make a little detour to explain why that might be. I was born in London, the 10th of 10 children living in a Rackman's slum. But the maths of 10 into 2 rooms doesn't work out too well, so my parents shipped me off as an infant back to the country they still refer to as home. British Guyana's people were as diverse as you could imagine. Europeans, Asians, Arabs, Africans, Native Americans. The only people I'd never met by the time I was a teenager were Australian Aborigines. That's because the British Empire functioned as a vast labour market machine, moving skills as necessary from here to there. Indian farmers over here to grow rice, Chinese merchant over there to provide food and supplies, for example. But as in so much of the old Commonwealth, behind the racial and religious rainbow, there lay a bitter and often violent history of ethnic feuding, which still disfigures that small country. One of my own classmates and friends, Donald Rodney, in later years saw his brother, the writer and academic Walter Rodney, murdered. Donald was himself injured by a car bomb, largely both of them for espousing the cause of non-racial politics in a deeply divided society. So I understand all too vividly what the reality of a multi-ethnic society can mean when it goes wrong. It is more than just a phrase. And perhaps I am overly sensitive to the risks of such social divisions. But actually, having experienced what this country has gone through over the past 4 years, I really don't think so. I was approached to give this talk late last year. Were it not for COVID-19, clever people would still be arguing, some in disbelief, about what took place on June the 23rd, 2016. In case you've forgotten, that was the day that Britain decided to leave the European Union. Many who were like me, were Remainers, still refused to accept that 52% of the British people made this particular choice whilst in full possession of their faculties. But we Remainers are not the only people to have misjudged the temper of the voters in recent times. In 2008, many Americans hailed the election of Barack Obama as heralding the arrival of a non-racial United States. If anything, precisely the reverse has taken place. Anyone who follows events in the USA will be aware of the killing 3 months ago of a young black man called Ahmaud Arbery whilst out jogging in Georgia. He was shot in cold blood, it is alleged, by 2 white men, by a father and son, one of whom had been a policeman. When I read about the case, I recalled that at the start of 2017, I had taken a trip across the South and written an essay about the post-Obama world for the Sunday Times. I'd spent some days with one of my older brothers, who, as it happens, lives about an hour's drive from where Arbery's killing took place. To my surprise, one day he warned me against crossing someone else's front garden on a morning run. And in my essay, I recalled this. I said, this is not the backwoods. These people are moderate citizens who voted narrowly for Obama in 2008 and narrowly for Romney in 2012. But after my brother's warning, suddenly the morning jog took on a shimmering patina of danger. Down here, the sight of a black stranger running across your front lawn is more likely to have you reaching for your rifle than to evoke the reassuring thought, harmless Brit. I didn't think of this at the time as a prediction. And actually, when I read it in the magazine, I wondered if I'd got a little carried away with my own prose. But as it turned out, my brother was simply telling it like it is. That is the United States. Even in continental Europe, our expectations are being constantly confounded. Until a year or so ago, the idea that far-right Nazi apologists would ever again sit in the German parliament would have provoked a storm of outrage. Yet right now, more than 90 individuals who even Mrs. Merkel has made clear she considers beyond the democratic pale now sit in the German parliament in Berlin under the banner of the Alternative for Deutschland. They, in some parts of Germany, have now risen to become the main opposition party. A recent poll suggested that half of all Germans expect them to be part of the government sometime in the next decade. These were strange and unnerving times even before the pandemic struck. The problem with democracy is that what may seem obvious to the folks in charge may not always be so clear to the people who do the voting. Those who called the referendum, those who said Trump couldn't win, those who sneered at the far right, are a bit like the US Civil War general who, glancing up at the enemy lines, scoffed, "They couldn't hit an elephant from that distance." Those were, in fact, his last words. An enemy sniper hadn't got the memo that it wasn't possible and blew the man's brains out. I think those of us who missed the point need to get over ourselves and try to understand what the people were telling us. I think they were telling us that we had lost sight of what matters most to people in modern developed societies. For much of my lifetime, it's been economics. We all know the phrase, supposedly coined by Harold Wilson, the pound in your pocket. But I think globalization has taken us into a new era. The Remain side fought a campaign in 2016, resolutely focused on the economic prospects of our decision. I believe that the real message of Brexit was that for the British people, there are things that matter more than money. Today, for very many Britons, the prospect of an unwelcome cultural change far outweighs the risk to prosperity. And by the way, for women and minorities, recognition of their values and their value to society also matters, sometimes more than material prosperity. In short, in today's politics, culture trumps economics. Polling data compiled by the former deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, Lord Ashcroft, showed that when it came to economics, there was little difference between Remainers and Leavers. Both tribes are equally split on the benefits or otherwise of free markets, and the current polling tells us that neither side really opposes the vast amount of spending by the state to tackle the coronavirus crisis. The real differences come over what we sometimes dismissively describe as identity politics, or worse, the culture wars. Remainers believe, by at least a 2-to-1 margin, that feminism, multiculturalism, environmentalism are pluses for our society. Leavers think, by similar margins, that they are minuses. Today, perhaps Bill Clinton's 1992 campaign slogan, "It's the economy, stupid," summing up what really matters in politics, might be better stated as, "It's identity, idiot." Globally, ethnic and religious conflicts are more frequent and more damaging. The question of identity confronts virtually every society in the world today. The problem of what Sir Isaiah Berlin called living together graciously has never been solved. And we here in Britain are facing into headwinds that are leading to greater and greater fragmentation of our society, often without our realizing it. We may come out and clap for our health workers each Thursday night, But this one act of solidarity hardly represents the ocean of social glue that we are going to need to withstand the forces of division. In many respects, this is not a new process or a new problem. It has been going on throughout my lifetime. My eldest sister worked in the Ford car plant at Dagenham, which at its height employed 60,000 people on the one site. My father worked first on the railways, then in the post office. For new immigrants, it was these vast workplaces that introduced us to those who were here before us, and where others got to know what we were about. There are now few of the vast car and manufacturing enterprises of the first half of the 20th century, where we are thrown together with others on the night shift from different backgrounds, where we get to understand each other through real work together. Indeed, in work undertaken by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, we showed that in some industrial sectors, food processing, for example, employers find it convenient to separate people of different nationalities, backgrounds, even genders. Lithuanians on the evening shift, Romanians overnight, Poles in the morning. Set next to that, the historic integrating roles of churches, trades unions, political parties has waned as their influence has faded. The armed forces, another binding force, are shrunk, and so is their social reach. Dare I said, perhaps the single individual who seems capable of bringing us together still, and we've seen this again recently, is Her Majesty the Queen. I would say that we will look back and be able to measure the impact of her recent broadcasts in steadying the nation at crucial moments in this period. Yet even she is swimming against the tide. Passing phenomenon, and that is what COVID-19 is, are still shifting social norms in the wrong direction. We know that the condition is twice as likely to kill men as women. We also know that the occupations dominated by women, nursing, social care, teaching, have continued through lockdown, whilst those more characteristically done by men have stalled: manufacturing, engineering, transport. The trauma of this period will have been felt differently, experienced differently, depending on whether you are a man or a woman. Much has been written about the possible differential effect, and Roger referred to this, on ethnic minorities. Right now, we can't be certain of exactly what is true, but it does seem likely that at the end of this acute phase, we'll have experienced the disease differently according to our ethnic or cultural background, and we will emerge from it in different ways. We also know that COVID is an age differentiator. Older people are more vulnerable and have worse outcomes than the young. But that's not the whole of it. The former cabinet minister, David Willetts, has written persuasively that baby boomers like me and him have taken advantage of a moment in history to pile up assets in property, to command the best jobs, and to bend consumer markets to our will. The economic measures the Chancellor has now taken will widen the gulf between those with savings, assets, and property, mostly older people, and those without, mostly younger. They are necessary, but in short, fissures that already existed in our society are being crowbarred even further open than they were before COVID. So today, one of the most powerful forces in our society, demographics, is emphasizing our social identity divisions. Another, technology, is turbocharging the cracks between us. Like most people, I thought that the World Wide Web would bring us together, breaking down the barriers of distance and nationality. In fact, Google tells us that the internet is actually fragmenting our society rather than uniting it. We seek out people who are like us and ignore other voices. And what's worse, the new technology is supercharging the exclusion of some groups. As far back as 1988, more than a decade before I became chair, the United Kingdom's Commission for Racial Equality found a British medical school guilty of discrimination because the computer program it was using to determine which applicants would be invited for interviews was determined to be biased against women and applicants with non-European names. However, the truth is the program had been developed to match human admissions decisions, doing so with 90 to 95% accuracy. The machines simply reinforced our own human prejudices. According to a senior Microsoft researcher and MIT visiting professor, Kate Crawford, who led an Obama White House symposium on the social and economic implications of artificial intelligence, quote, sexism, racism, and other forms of discrimination are being built into the machine learning algorithms, close quotes. Each day, millions of decisions all over the globe about who gets what job, who is eligible for a home loan or a car loan, and even who goes to prison are dependent on the workings of artificial intelligence. High-profile embarrassments so far have led to myriad unintended racial slights, facial recognition programs that can't cope with dark skins, apps that categorize images of black people as gorillas, camera software that registers Asian people as blinking. I myself found that for a period, the digital trace generated by my laptop identified me as probably black. Okay, no secret about that. But as a result, I received dozens of emails specifically tailored to my race, including several offers from bail bondsmen to bail me out next time I happen to find myself in jail. Presumably a frequent occurrence to the algorithm. More alarmingly, algorithms designed to help courts decide on the likelihood of defendants committing further crimes have been shown to flag black defendants as being twice as likely to be high risk as whites. Women have found that job sites have been trained inadvertently to offer them lower paying and lower status opportunities. So can we do anything about it? Well, I'm not sure how much. We can meddle with the algorithms. We can monitor outcomes. We will almost certainly pass new laws, putting new responsibilities on the digital platforms. But even so, I think there are going to be some more profound things we need to think about. Possibly the single most important issue for us as a society is to reach some consensus on what identity fairness looks like. And I mean fairness, not equality. Few people today would argue, as some did a couple of generations ago, that societies need the competitive vigor of inequality to give the poor an incentive to get richer and to give the rich the resources to support the poor. That might have been right for the Victorians, but it really won't wash today. Nobody now would shrug their shoulders and say that poverty is just bad luck or bad blood. But fairness is something different. It isn't just making sure we get paid the same or that we have equal access to jobs and homes. It also means that we should be entitled to equal respect in a society, that we should have a voice, and that that voice should be heard. Dealing with identity fairness tends to make politicians, indeed most public figures, uncomfortable. But we're going to need to have some new rules about identity fairness if we're to manage the tensions inherent in diverse modern societies where to people their identity really matters. And this is a particularly difficult issue for the British. We don't like rules that govern our personal behaviours, as we're beginning to see as lockdown frays at the edges. Every immigrant, by the way, already knows this, because nobody ever tells you when you arrive in Britain what the rules are. The British resist being too explicit or prescriptive about these things. We tend to regard them as matters of common sense and good judgment. For example, a couple of years ago, I was invited to what was described as a small, informal supper at a government stately home. Very nice. Well, actually, small meant 24 people, not quite my family's definition of a small supper party. And informal meant an invitation on a stiff card with the words, "No dress code," at the bottom. Well, that is not a problem if you're a bloke. You wear a suit and no tie. For a woman, it's a bit more complicated. Obviously, no tiaras, but pearls or not pearls, summer frock or business suit, trousers or skirt. Well, my wife made me ring up some people who'd been before to get some steer on the rules. And their guidance was typically English. Encouraging, but totally vague and useless. Happily, my wife, who as it happens, is a sister of Selwyn's vice master, and like Janet, has been raised by parents to have confidence and good sense, wore an outfit in which she felt comfortable. And of course, being a woman of taste and discernment, she got it right. But the point of the story is that it taught me a lesson about our country. When somebody says no dress code, what it really means is that if you don't already know what the code is, are you sure you really belong here? Well, we can't go on that way in the 21st century. I don't want to suggest that everyone gets a book of etiquette, but maybe somebody should write down some of these rules for public debate, a kind of highway code for national identity, to smooth the frictions of our vociferous, diverse society. And at the heart of this must be a clear conception of the idea of fairness. We've always been practically good at this as a society, but I don't think British muddling along will be good enough in this century. And I want to give you an example of what I mean about what we have to deal with. We all know that some professions have, for one reason or another, been effectively closed to women. Many of us know that even where determined efforts have been made to rectify the problem, biases still exist. And some of us have, willingly or not, undergone training to combat our unconscious biases. We've introduced ideas such as application forms in which names are removed so that decision makers are deprived of information that might lead them to discriminate. In selection for seats in orchestras, players audition from behind a screen, even removing their shoes to avoid making sounds that might identify them as man or woman. This principle is called fairness through unawareness. In some circumstances, it works, and we like it in Britain because it takes away the responsibility to make decisions. But here's the problem. Admissions to a Cambridge college is at least a judgment, not just on what you might have done, but also what you might become. We need to know what sort of person you are. So how can the process take account of what you have been and what you are if it reveals nothing about your past, just in case it reveals something about your identity characteristics? My EHRC colleagues in Northern Ireland, for example, always told me that there was absolutely no point in introducing name-blind applications there, because in Belfast, your home address or your school was the clearest possible signal of whether you were a Catholic or a Protestant. Nobody needed to know your name. There were all sorts of workarounds, but for the most part, they proved to be unsuccessful. And where they make a difference, they tend, if anything, to work against the disadvantage. For example, a scheme in the United States which removed any information about criminal convictions, which should have helped people of colour, merely led to employers, on average, assuming that a person of colour was more likely to have had a conviction. And in the United States, that is a statistically valid assumption. And therefore, that person would be less employable. In practice, over time, it made people of colour less likely to be hired rather than more so. Similar experiments in relation to gender have produced mixed results. My own view, for what it's worth, is that ignorance is never a great strategy in anything. I think that the more information we have, the better. I would make the case for more fairness through greater awareness. I would propose that admissions tutors should know more about potential students rather than less, that judges understand more about a woman's family background rather than less, that we keep more data to tell us about racial and age inequalities rather than less. And here, the trauma of COVID-19 may well be the catalyst that brings us screeching into the 21st century. In our work to try to understand ethnic disparities in COVID-19, there is no question in my mind that we have already lost many weeks, possibly months, in understanding the problem because we do not keep ethnicity data on death certificates. We do not record it systematically on infection or on hospitalization. We know far too little about who does what kind of work, whether being a bus driver or a checkout person or somebody who is a hospital porter makes you more susceptible to the disease. Every day we lose in not understanding the problem may mean more avoidable deaths and more unnecessary suffering. I know why it is said we do not want to keep certain kind of data. Privacy, individual rights, and so on. Let's be clear, there is no privacy perfection that is worth the kind of sacrifice that we are seeing. We can't leave these issues to be decided by nerds, by the way. By the way, they are mostly disproportionately young, male and white. We urgently need to reach a clear understanding of what we tell the computers who make judgments about fairness, what we want from them. We can do a great deal to train them on better data. We can check their outputs to make sure that they aren't systematically biased. But even the smartest computer algorithms have to make choices. Right now, We work on the premise that it's better for the machines to know nothing about our gender or race. For me, it is time to adopt the inverse principle. The greater our awareness, the greater the fairness, and the more likely we are to be a united society. This is just one example of the challenge that faces us and other developed society. My point today is that here in the United Kingdom, we generally imagine that we can find a pragmatic solution to most problems. I think that may be right if you are a powerful empire with the most advanced technology, able to control your destiny with a largely monocultural society, and if you are to some extent sheltered from cultural and technological change. But in a period of extreme technological disruption, competition from a global power, and I am talking about China, unprecedented flows of migration around the globe, we are not protected. We are not in charge. We will be hard put to hold it together, given the forces that will buffet us. There will be no return to the relative tranquility of the Britain of 1882. As it happens, I believe that this country has the flexibility, the temperament, and the character to sail these turbulent waters. And here in Cambridge and its other great universities, the brains to draw the best map available. We just have to have the nerve to boldly go where history has yet to venture. Thank you.
Trevor, thank you so much. And the only thing I regret about a lecture being online is you can't hear the round of applause, which I'm sure will be ringing around the lecture theatre if you were here in person, and we were too. But thank you on behalf of everyone who's listening. And I would just say to people, do send in your questions via Zoom chat. Some people have done that already, and I can see some people saying clap, clap already. So thank you, Carl Winkworth and others. Trevor, let me just ask you about that concept of identity fairness. Is it something that in the end would come from government or from individuals? And is it by law or is it voluntary? How would it happen if it were to happen?
Well, I'm a great believer, and this is one of the reasons that I live in this country and not elsewhere, that we are a great country of gradualism, and our gradualism is almost always led by the people, hardly ever by government. Generally speaking, I know that people say, for example, government brought in law about smoking and so on, and that's what changed things. Well, it's partly true, but generally speaking, in this country, governments cannot do things without the willing consent, and I don't mean formal, I mean the cultural consent of people. When I talk about identity fairness, I want to take you back to probably the person I regard personally as this country's greatest ever leader, and that is the first Elizabeth. This Elizabeth's doing a pretty good job, but the first Elizabeth was in so many ways an extraordinary person. One of the things that she invented, more or less, and championed was the idea of toleration. Now, historically, that's a slightly different idea from the modern notion of the sort of milk and water notion of tolerance. Specifically, what the first Elizabeth would say at a time, bear in mind, when persecution of Catholics was rampant, she had the courage to say, look, we are a country in which we understand what the sovereign authority is, we understand what the prayer book says, but we need to be open to different ways of seeing the world. And insofar as that particular group, in this case Catholics, recognize and acknowledge that sovereign authority, they should not be persecuted. Now, whether or not Elizabeth administration actually stuck to that, subject of historical argument, but the notion of toleration is central to what we are as a people. So to come to your question, my view is that this will come from the people, from us arguing, debating robustly about our differences, and government, as they always do, will do the job of codifying what we have already decided. to give you a very good and I think recent example. The quickest change, cultural and legal change that I have seen in the areas that I've worked in my lifetime has been the end of the persecution of LGBT people. Now, that happened, if you chart it, it literally happened within a decade. Almost unthinkable. I mean, the change in gender attitudes, changes in attitude towards race took decades. That one went incredibly fast. Why? Because the British people, for reasons we still don't quite understand, took the view, we don't want to be like that anymore. Government followed it, and it happened like that. So I think this idea of identity fairness will emerge from us talking about it openly and honestly and robustly, and the government will follow.
Trevor, there are lots of questions coming in, so we'll go through them as quickly as we can.
I'll try and be quick.
No, there's one which actually unites Richard Pelly and Sam Fitzgerald, who are asking the question about how you separate individual rights from communal rights. So Richard says, individual rights against community rights. Will the Coronavirus Act, for instance, tip the balance more towards community rights over individuals?
Well, I'll answer that in a reverse order. I think the answer to the last part is almost certainly yes, because I believe that, but that's because I think that the framing of the use of artificial intelligence tools, machine learning, automatic decision making, has been rather, it's been a poor framing up until now. It has been constructed, and the law, data protection and so on, has been constructed entirely in relation to the protection of individual holding of an individual's holding of their own information. What we have not done in our debates about what that law should be is to think, as we are having to do now in relation to COVID-19, where does the community need to hold information to protect the whole community? And I think this period will accelerate and raise the importance of that point. And secondly, I also think that we haven't really, partly because of who controls the digital platforms, we haven't really understood the benefits that we've acquired from the digital universe in an articulate way. I mean, we all know, if you sat down and you think about it, what was it like before we had mobile phones? I mean, what was it like before we could do this on Zoom? Nobody wants to go back to those days. But I think that we haven't really laid that out properly. And what I hope is, personally, coming out of this, that we will rebalance the debate about those issues. I mean, in truth, I mean, on an everyday basis, how many of us really go through that long document that says, Google sets this conditions, go through it, tick at the bottom. All of us go to the bottom and we tick agree, because we know that the benefit to us of using this tool outweighs any likely harm to us as individuals. So I think COVID-19 will rebalance that consideration quite dramatically.
Okay, Vivian Nutton asks, how can historians deal with the competing identity histories of individual groups? And that's also picked up by Anita Fowle, who says, you've illustrated how you connect to your history and make connections to others and their history. How can a white person make such connections when their ancestors were on the other side, so to speak?
Well, I can't quite see the thing framed in that way. 25 years ago, my brother and I embarked on a project which started really as an attempt to say something about the Caribbean experience in the United Kingdom. When we started on that project, we just wanted to tell a story of the family. But what we then realized was that the thing that had been missing was not so much you know, here's what Caribbean people are like. Everybody, you know, there's loads of kind of books and multiculturalism about what it's like to be Jamaican and Guyanese and so on and so forth. But what we didn't have was the story of how we interacted with these islands. And I don't mean as colonials, I don't mean as empire subjects, but as people who are part, lived next door to everybody here, shared the workbench, and so on. That story had not been told. And that became the series that was put on by BBC at that time, called Windrush, and the book that we wrote called Windrush, and Windrush has become code for all sorts of things now. But the important thing about it was that I came to regard that history not as my history, it's as much the questioner's history as it is mine. You know, because I experience it in a certain way, doesn't mean that it doesn't also belong to you. I mean, bear in mind, if we're talking about the history of race relations, the important word there is relations. It isn't the history of black people. It's a history of all people who are mixing and trying to get along and trying to negotiate their differences. So I don't really think of this as my history or your history. I think it is a better way to think of it is as a tapestry. And one of the things that we are now beginning to understand about history is that in that tapestry, quite often, there are threads which have faded or have been taken out or were never there in the first place. Windrush, we saw in the end as a new thread in the tapestry of modern British history that nobody had ever woven in. And one of the things that's most amusing, not amusing, one of the things that's most interesting about it is nobody had ever heard of Windrush before we wrote the book and did the series. But almost the minute we put it out there, it completely escaped us. It stopped being Mike and Trevor Phillips' possession. And now everybody owns Windrush. And that's the best possible thing that could have happened.
Trevor, I'm going to try, and I think we need to end in about 10 minutes. So if you're happy to keep going for that, we will.
Yeah,
I just note that Sir Simon Hughes says, claps, thanks and appreciation for Trevor from the president of the Alumni Association. So that's nice. And Andrew Flather saying, thank you for your excellent talk. Andrew's question is an interesting one. As human interactions move increasingly away from face-to-face or even verbal interaction, do you think the ability publicly to accept compromise and the humanity of the opposing party in a debate will continue to diminish?
Wow, what a smart question, if I may say so. I don't think that the means by which we communicate are in and of themselves more than a marginal contributor to what I agree is the idea that a failure to accept compromise. I think, and here everybody listening can blame Roger and me as, you know, long-time media people. I think that the political and media classes, particularly in this country, it's also true to some extent in the United States, have for one reason or another abandoned much of the idea of what I would consider a dispassionate analysis. The idea of advocacy seems to me to have taken such strong hold that actually it's almost impossible for people to get into a conversation in which they can imagine that the other person who might disagree with them is disagreeing for a reason to do with their experience or their understanding or a set of data or facts that they have. But we tend more often to attribute their disagreement to their malign motives or their stupidity. Now, I think the inability to compromise is probably much more to do with that trend than it is to do with a means of communication. And I so wish that we could somehow, particularly amongst what the constitutional historian Vernon Bogdanor calls the exam passing classes, people like us, I imagine people who are listening to this, I so wish that we would perhaps sometimes start to put down the intellectual cudgels and not enter into debates purely in order to win. Maybe there's a room here for a movement that says, let's listen and let's accept that sometimes we don't know it all and that somebody else has something to say. Maybe I say that, of course, because I've got a scientific background. Part of your intellectual framing is that whatever you've got right now is that it's wrong. Somebody else will come up with a better theory. I wish in public life, in social sciences and in politics, we had a little bit more of that.
This one from Paul New may have a fairly short answer. I suppose it could be yes, no, but is there a danger that in seeking to correct for biased treatment of people of a particular identity, we accentuate the divisions? And supplementary, if so, how can we avoid that?
It's a great question. And I think the answer is no. And I say that not because I don't think those divisions would occur, but what I would say is that those divisions happen even if you try and pretend they don't exist. I always remember, again, going back to Northern Ireland, someone saying something, someone very experienced and quite well known in Northern Ireland, saying to me after the Good Friday Agreement, a few years after, that people did not understand that that agreement, though it was incredibly important, did not solve the problem of what people said to each other and to their children around the kitchen table. And I think that we, again, the exam passing classes, the elite and so on, need to be a little bit humble and remember that just because we say to people, you must be good, you must understand other people, you must share and embrace diversity and so on, that they're going to do that. One of the tragedies of the country that my family comes from is that we have several different ethnic groups. Most of us were brought there. And you would think that actually we as we got to know each other, which we do, we get to be more friendly and so on. Actually, the truth of the matter is, the more we got to know each other, the more divided we became and less we liked each other. And that is why, for example, in that country right now, politics is racially divided. They had an election 2 months ago. The electorate is less than 500,000 people. They still haven't managed to count all the votes. Now that is a sort of cultural division. So I think the answer is that I would love to think that if we played down these differences, they'd sort of go away. Nothing in history tells us that that's what happens. I think it is much better to put them out in the open, negotiate them respectfully and openly and generously, but do not hide from the fact that we do have different ways, different groups have different ways of looking at things.
A couple of comments, actually. One from our chaplain, Hugh St Thomas, who says that the largest chapel bell is not just named after Gladstone, it was given by him, and Littleton persuaded him to make it a personal gift. So that's about the bell. A comment from Sam Jacobs, who says, such an important point about how we, and he says definitely me, dismiss people's different views as due to them being stupid or malign, rather than because of the info and experiences they have. Wonderful lecture, thank you. And I'm probably going to come to the last question now, Trevor, which, coming from one of our fellows, is typically Smarty Pants Fellows question from Gavin Jarvis, who says, based on what you said earlier, what in your view is unimaginable to the brilliant minds of today that will be obvious to ordinary folk in 100 years' time?
Nice one. I have no idea, because one of the things I don't have is that brilliant mind. I'll tell you what I will say, and I will draw on somebody who does have a properly brilliant mind, and that is your Cambridge colleague, Lord Rees, Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal. And Martin has a very, very interesting take on the future. And he says, there are 2 points I'll make about what he says. First of all, that it's later than you think, and that actually some of the things that we think we want to rescue are already gone, and we should stop worrying about them. Some aspects of climate change and so on. But on the other hand, he says that, of course, we're an incredibly adaptable species, and we will probably find our way through. The other thing he says, which in a way contradicts some of that, is we're just a species. And actually, we will not kill the Earth. The Earth may dispense with us, but actually, let's have some humility and understand. And this is somebody who studies planets and has the brain size of a planet. You can understand why he would say that. We should actually just accept that we are not gods, and we will not be masters of all we survey. We can do the best we can, but let's not pretend we'll be here forever. So part of the answer to your question is, what we cannot imagine right now is the Earth without us. And I would invite you to imagine that that is, for one reason or another, pandemic, war, simply we give up the ghost. That is entirely plausible. And maybe that's one of the things that currently lies outside of our imagination. I'll offer you that.
Trevor, I'm seeing on the screen lots and lots of people thanking you. So Brunel James, thank you for an excellent presentation. Kenneth Williams, thank you so much. Great lecture and great questions. Richard Pelly, excellent talk, clapping enthusiastically. As I say, I just wish we could hear that. But can I thank all our alumni and friends for being with us tonight? And if you've enjoyed it, we will do more. Ian McFarlane saying very much appreciated. Anita Fowle, very insightful. Emily Hodgkinson, thank you so much. Joshua Marr, thanks very much. Excellent talk, thoroughly enjoyed it. Tim Langford, excellent. They're just streaming in now. So incredible hour and a half, more of the same, please, from Marcus Bleasdale. I enjoyed that. Victoria Young, wonderful talk, Sarah Horner. So thank you so much, everybody, for responding. And we have been talking only today about doing more of these. Obviously, the Ramsay Murray Lecture will continue to be our most prestigious event, but we will add more webinars and seminars because there's been such good response to this. But most of all, let me thank you, Trevor. That was brilliant. We are truly, truly grateful. It's been a wonderful Ramsay Murray Lecture, and thank you very much for delivering it. Thanks very much indeed.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, Roger. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.